The train didn't just stop, it died. One moment it was a beast of steel and steam, clawing its way through the Montana wilderness. The next it was a cold corpse on the tracks, its final breath hissing into the air, an air so frigid it felt like shattered glass against the lungs. I pressed my face to the frosted window, a city girl named Elalanina Hayes, searching for a single light, a single sign of life in a world that had been bleached of all color. There was nothing, only white, and the promise of more white to come. The conductor's voice was a funeral bell tolling through the car. Last stop before the blizzard hits. Anyone for Copper Falls, it's now or never. Now or never. That was the choice, wasn't it? Step off this train into a howling void or ride back to the life I was running from. I clutched my bag. Tucked inside was my wedding dress and a single photograph of a man I'd never met. Thomas Brennan, my future husband. His advertisement in the Chicago paper wasn't a proposal. It was a command, just 7 words long. Come to Copper Falls. We'll provide everything needed. What he didn't say, what those 7 words hid, was a truth so dark it would swallow everything I thought I knew about survival. What was waiting for me out there wasn't a husband. It was a reckoning. And if you think you know where this story's going, I promise you, you don't have a clue. The wooden platform groaned under my boots like a coffin lid. The cold wasn't just cold. It was a physical blow, a thief that stole the air from my chest and left a hollow ache in its place. The snow wasn't falling. It was attacking, swarming in a horizontal frenzy of tiny frozen knives. My wool coat, my best coat, was a useless piece of paper against the onslaught. I was going to die out here. That was my first thought. Not of my new husband, not of my new life, but of the sheer brutal power of this place. It didn't care about my hopes or my carefully packed wedding dress. It just wanted to erase me. Elalanina Hayes. The voice was not a question. It was a statement of ownership. It came from the storm itself, a shape of a man emerging from the swirling white. He was tall, broader than any man I'd ever seen, a mountain carved from rock and rage. His beard was a wild thing, caked with ice, and his eyes. His eyes were the color of a frozen lake, pale and deep and utterly devoid of warmth. They weren't welcoming. They were assessing, like a wolf sizing up prey. Yes, I managed, my voice a pathetic little tremor. You must be Thomas Brennan. He didn't answer. He just gave a single, curt nod, a gesture so dismissive it made me feel like an inconvenience. He reached for my bag, his hand a slab of scarred leather. There was no gentleness in the touch, only brutal efficiency. Storm's coming fast, he grunted, his voice the sound of rocks grinding together. He tossed my bag into a weathered wagon as if it weighed nothing. Get in. I scrambled onto the seat, pulling my skirts tight around me, a useless defense against the invading cold. He didn't offer a blanket. He didn't offer a word of comfort. He just snapped the reins, and the horses, 2 powerful, grim-looking beasts, plunged us directly into the heart of the tempest. We rode in a silence that was louder than the screaming wind. This wasn't the awkward silence of 2 strangers meeting for the first time. This was something heavier, something dangerous. I stole glances at him, this man who was supposed to be my husband, and found nothing. His face was a mask of stone, his attention fixed on a trail only he could see. Where was the shy farmer from the letters? The man who wrote of wanting a partner to share the lonely winters? This man wasn't lonely. He was empty. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, each tick of it a tiny hammer against my sanity. I had to break it. I had to know something, anything about the man I'd just entrusted my life to. How much further? My voice was a thin thread of sound, nearly ripped away by the wind. He didn't even turn his head. Mile. Just 1 word. Not a mile or so. Not we're almost there. Just mile. It wasn't an answer. It was a dismissal. And then through the blinding curtain of snow, a shape began to form. A dark blot against the endless white. The ranch. It was less a home and more a fortress. A log cabin built to withstand a siege. A barn hunched beside it like a loyal guard dog. Smoke clawed its way out of the chimney, a desperate signal against the oppressive gray sky. Everything was weathered, beaten, but brutally solid. This wasn't a place for living. It was a place for surviving. He pulled the wagon to a halt and was on the ground before the wheels had stopped turning. He reached up for me, his hands circling my waist. For a split second, I thought it was a gesture of care. I was wrong. He didn't help me down. He lifted me, swung me through the air, and set me on the porch with the unceremonious efficiency of a man unloading a sack of grain. Our faces were inches apart, and in that moment, I saw it. A flicker of something in those frozen lake eyes. It wasn't kindness. It was something else. Something possessive. Then he dropped his hands as if my skin had burned him and stepped back. "Inside," he commanded, grabbing my bag. "Fire's warm." The cabin was just as stark as the man. Rough furniture, a stone fireplace that spat and hissed, and shelves lined with practical, soulless supplies. It was clean, unnervingly clean, organized with a precision that felt less like tidiness and more like an obsession. But it was the layout that made the blood in my veins turn to ice. There was a main room, a small kitchen area, and a single solitary bedroom, its door hanging slightly ajar. Just one bedroom. "You can have the bedroom," he said, his voice flat, emotionless. He'd followed my terrified gaze. "I'll take the loft." He gestured with his thumb toward a rickety ladder leading to a dark, shadowy space above. I felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled my knees, but it was followed by a cold spike of confusion. Why would a man who advertised for a wife arrange for separate sleeping quarters? It wasn't consideration. It felt like a rule, a boundary I wasn't meant to cross. He walked to the window, staring out at the blizzard, which had become a living, screaming entity. "This one's going to last," he said, his back to me. 3, maybe 4 days. We're stuck." Stuck. The word echoed in the oppressive silence of the cabin. Stuck in the middle of nowhere. Stuck in a world-ending blizzard. Stuck with a man who was nothing like his letters. A man who looked at me not as a bride, but as something else. Something he'd acquired. And as I stood there, shivering more from fear than from cold, my eyes scanned the room, desperate for a sign of the life he'd described. A sign of the first wife, Martha, a quilt she'd made, a book she'd loved, a faded photograph on the mantel. There was nothing. It was as if she had never existed at all. I had to do something, anything, to feel less like a captive and more like a person. "Are you hungry?" I asked, my voice sounding impossibly small in the big room. I could cook something. It's what wives do, isn't it? The word wives hung between us, a fragile, hollow thing. He turned from the window, and for the first time, a genuine expression crossed his face. Surprise. As if the idea of me performing a domestic task was the most bizarre thing he'd ever heard. He stared at me for a long, uncomfortable moment, those pale eyes seeming to strip away every layer of my composure. Then he gave another one of his curt nods and pointed to a cupboard. "Supplies are there." It wasn't permission, it was a test. I found salt pork, beans, and flour, and set about making a meal, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the utensils. The simple, familiar act of cooking was an anchor in a swirling sea of dread. He disappeared outside, into the full fury of the storm, to tend to the animals. When he returned, he was a creature of ice and snow, his beard a solid mass of white. "Animals are secure," he announced, his tone leaving no room for discussion. We ate in that same crushing silence. I tried to make conversation, asking about the ranch, about the cattle. His answers were clipped, surgically precise, offering information but no connection. He owned the land. He'd worked it for 8 years. When I finally worked up the courage to ask about his first wife, his face became a granite mask. "Fever," he said, his voice flat. 3 winters ago." He said the word fever as if it were a shield, a wall to hide behind. There was no sadness in his voice, no hint of loss, just a cold statement of fact. After the meal, he didn't even say goodnight. He just scraped his chair back, climbed the ladder to the loft, and disappeared into the shadows above. I was left alone in the main room, the fire casting dancing, monstrous shapes on the walls. I retreated to the bedroom, my supposed sanctuary, and my hand went to the door. I felt for a lock. There was one, a heavy iron bolt. My fingers trembled as I slid it home, the sound echoing in the silent cabin like a gunshot. But then I saw it, a detail so small, so horrifying, it made the air freeze in my lungs. There was another bolt, on the outside of the door. My sanctuary wasn't a sanctuary at all. It was a cell, and the lock was there to keep me in, not to keep him out. I lay in that bed, fully dressed, listening to the storm rage and the soft, rhythmic sounds from the loft above. But it wasn't the sound of a man sleeping. It was the sound of wood being worked, a soft, steady scraping. Scrape, scrape, scrape. What was he doing up there in the dark? What was he carving? The sound went on for hours, a terrifying, methodical rhythm that drilled its way into my soul. I wasn't a mail-order bride. I was something else entirely. I had walked willingly into a trap, and the man in the loft was the patient, silent spider at the center of the web. The scraping from the loft finally stopped just before dawn. I hadn't slept. I had lain there, rigid with terror, my ears straining against the howl of the wind. When I finally crept out of the bedroom, he was gone. The cabin was empty. A pot of coffee, black and bitter, was warming by the fire. It felt less like a courtesy and more like fuel for a worker. I forced myself to go outside, my boots sinking into the deep, fresh snow. The storm still raged, a white fury that blurred the world into a single, terrifying wall of motion. I found him in the barn. He was splitting logs, the axe rising and falling with a brutal, mechanical precision. Each strike was a punctuation mark in the storm's screaming monologue. He didn't seem to feel the cold. He was a part of it, as relentless and unforgiving as the blizzard itself. "Good morning," I called out, my voice swallowed by the wind. He stopped, the axe held motionless in midair. He looked at me, his eyes as pale and empty as the sky, and gave that single infuriating nod. Then he turned back to his work, splitting another log with a crack that sounded like a breaking bone. I was dismissed, ignored. I was just a piece of furniture in his fortress, but I couldn't accept that. I had to find a way in. I had to understand the monster I was trapped with. "Can I help?" I shouted over the wind. "With the horses?" He paused again, a flicker of something, annoyance, surprise, crossing his face. He seemed to consider it, then gestured with the axe toward the stalls. "They need brushing." His tone was flat, as if he were daring me to prove my uselessness. I spent the morning in a strange, silent partnership with him. I brushed the horses, their warm breath fogging in the frigid air, while he moved about the barn, repairing tack, checking supplies, his movements economical and precise. He didn't speak to me, but I could feel him watching. I could feel those cold eyes on me, measuring, judging. It was a test. Every move I made was being scrutinized. When we returned to the cabin, the tension was a physical thing, a third presence in the room. As we ate a silent meal of bread and cheese, I caught him staring at me, a strange, calculating look on his face. He was trying to figure me out, trying to decide what I was and what he would do with me. "Storm should break tomorrow," he said, the first unsolicited words he'd spoken all day. My heart leaped. Tomorrow, freedom, a chance to get to town, to find help, to escape. "What happens then?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Town," he said. "Reverend Morrison, get this done. Get this done, like a chore, like a piece of ranch work that had to be completed." There was no joy, no anticipation, only a grim sense of duty and a threat. Once we were married, I would be his property, legally bound to him in this prison of a ranch. My chances of escape would shrink to nothing. I had to find a way out. I had to find a weapon. And in a cabin this sparse, the only weapons were secrets. That afternoon, while he was occupied in the barn, I began my search. I moved through the small cabin with a feigned casualness, my heart hammering against my ribs. I started with the bookshelves. They were a bizarre collection. Manuals on animal husbandry and crop rotation were crammed next to volumes of dark, brooding poetry. Poe, Hawthorne, stories of madness and obsession. There were no novels, no light reading, only practical guides and explorations of the human soul at its bleakest. Then I saw it. Tucked behind a thick book on cattle diseases was a small leather-bound journal. It was worn, the corners softened with use. My hands trembled as I pulled it from the shelf. This had to be Martha's. This had to be the key. I opened it, my breath catching in my throat. The handwriting was elegant, feminine, a stark contrast to the brutal masculinity of the cabin. The first few entries were filled with hope. Arrived in Montana today. Thomas is a kind, gentle man, though quiet. The land is harsh but beautiful. I believe we can build a good life here. Thomas. She called him Thomas, and he was kind, gentle. The man she described was a universe away from the silent, menacing creature I was trapped with. What had happened to him? What had this place done to him? I kept reading, my eyes flying across the pages. The entries grew more strained. The loneliness, the crushing isolation, began to bleed through the ink. The silence is the hardest part. Thomas works from sunup to sundown. He speaks so little. I feel like a ghost in my own home. And then the entries turn dark. He has a brother, Caleb. He came to visit today. There is a darkness in him, a jealousy in his eyes when he looks at Thomas. He frightens me. Caleb, a brother. He'd never mentioned a brother. I flipped through the pages, my blood running cold. The final entry was scrawled, almost illegible, the ink smudged as if by tears or rain. Caleb is here again. Thomas is out on the range. The look in his eyes. He said Thomas doesn't deserve me. He said this land, this life, should be his. I've locked myself in the bedroom. He's outside the door. Oh God, Thomas, please come home. That was it. The rest of the pages were blank. I slammed the journal shut, my mind reeling. The man I was with, he wasn't Thomas. He had to be Caleb, the dark brother, the jealous one. But where was Thomas? What had Caleb done to him? The front door creaked open, and I shoved the journal back onto the shelf just as he stepped inside. Flakes of snow melting in his dark beard. He looked at me, then at the bookshelf, and his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Find something interesting?" he asked, his voice deceptively soft. "Just admiring your books," I lied, my voice shaking. "You have eclectic tastes." He didn't believe me. I could see it in the tightening of his jaw, the cold fire that ignited in the depths of his eyes. He knew I was searching. He knew I was getting closer to the truth. And now he knew he couldn't let me leave. The second night was a new kind of hell. I didn't bother bolting my door. I knew it was useless. Instead, I sat in a chair, my back pressed against the wall, a heavy iron poker from the fireplace clutched in my hands. I listened. I waited. The scraping sound started again from the loft. But this time it was different. Faster, more frantic. It was the sound of a man running out of time. My mind raced, piecing together the horrifying puzzle. Caleb had done something to his brother Thomas. He'd taken his place, taken his ranch, and was now trying to take his wife. He was living a stolen life. The ad in the paper, the letters, they must have been from the real Thomas before Caleb intervened. I had come to Montana expecting to marry a kind, gentle man, and instead I had been delivered into the hands of his monster of a brother. What had happened to the other women? The diary mentioned I was not the first. The thought was a cold stone in my stomach. Had he lured others here? What had become of them? The blizzard was my prison, but it was also my shield. As long as the storm raged, he couldn't take me to town. He couldn't force me into a marriage that would seal my doom. But the storm wouldn't last forever. The silence from the loft was sudden. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensed. I heard the creak of the ladder, the soft thud of boots on the main floor. He was coming. I gripped the poker, my knuckles white. The main room was lit only by the dying embers in the fireplace. His shadow fell across my bedroom door, a huge, menacing shape that blotted out the light. He didn't try the handle. He just stood there, breathing. I could hear his slow, steady breaths just on the other side of the thin wooden door. He knew I was awake. He knew I was waiting. It was a game of cat and mouse, and he was enjoying every second of it. Then he spoke, his voice a low whisper that slid under the door like a venomous snake. You found her journal, didn't you? It wasn't a question. You think you know things, but you don't know the half of it. He let out a low, humorless chuckle. Martha wasn't strong enough for this place. She wasn't strong enough for me. My brother, he was weak. He filled her head with soft words and useless poetry. This land doesn't need poetry. It needs blood and bone and will. He paused, and the silence was more terrifying than his words. You're different, he whispered. I saw it the moment you stepped off that train. You've got fire in you. You're a survivor, just like me. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My throat was clamped shut with terror. Tomorrow, he said, his voice hardening, the storm breaks. We go to town. We become husband and wife, and you will be a good wife. You'll learn what it means to belong to me. You'll forget all about my weak, pathetic brother. You'll forget you ever read that foolish little book. His shadow disappeared from the door. I heard him add a log to the fire, the sound a crack of doom in the quiet cabin. Then the creak of the ladder as he returned to his loft. The game was over. He had laid his cards on the table, and tomorrow my time would run out. As promised, the world was born anew in silence and blinding light. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape sculpted from diamonds and glass. It was beautiful, and it was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. The road to town would be clear by afternoon. My prison sentence was about to become a life sentence. Caleb, I had to call him Caleb in my own mind, had to hold on to that truth, was already outside, hitching the horses to the wagon. He moved with a grim purpose, his jaw set. Today was the day he would legitimize his theft, the day he would legally own me. I had to do something. I had to find a way. My eyes scanned the cabin, searching for a weapon, an escape route. The poker was too clumsy. The knives in the kitchen were too obvious. He would overpower me in an instant. My only hope was the town, the Reverend Morrison. Maybe someone there could help me, if I could just get a message to them, a signal of my distress. As I packed my small bag, my hands pretending a bridal nervousness I did not feel, my fingers brushed against the photograph, the picture of the man I thought I was marrying, Thomas Brennan. I studied his face. He had the same strong features as Caleb, but the hardness was absent. His eyes were kind, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. This was the man from the diary, the man who loved poetry, the man Caleb had called weak. An idea, a desperate, wild gamble, began to form in my mind. It was a long shot. It could get me killed, but it was the only shot I had. I'm ready, I said, stepping out onto the porch. My voice was surprisingly steady. Caleb looked at me, a flicker of something that might have been approval in his eyes. He thought I had accepted my fate. He thought I had submitted. He was wrong. The ride to Copper Falls was a silent, tense journey through a world of breathtaking beauty. The snow-laden pines, the distant mountains scraping against a brilliant blue sky. It all felt like a cruel joke, a beautiful stage for a horrific play. Caleb sat beside me, a silent, brooding presence. He thought he had won. He didn't know I was about to set the stage on fire. Copper Falls was little more than a single street carved out of the wilderness, a collection of wooden buildings huddled together for warmth and company. As we rode down the main thoroughfare, I saw faces in the windows watching us pass. There was a curiosity in their gazes, but something else too, a watchfulness, a fear. Did they know? Did they suspect what Caleb was? The church was a simple white building, its steeple pointing to the sky like a hopeful finger. Reverend Morrison met us at the door. He was a thin, tired-looking man with eyes that held a deep, weary sadness. Thomas, he said, his voice hesitant as he shook Caleb's hand. It's good to see you. His eyes darted to me, and I saw a flicker of pity in them. And this must be Miss Hayes. Welcome to Copper Falls. The ceremony was a nightmare, a surreal, hollow ritual performed in the Reverend's stuffy parlor. His wife and the town doctor, a grim-faced man who wouldn't meet my eyes, served as witnesses. I stood beside Caleb, my body rigid, my mind racing. When the Reverend asked for the rings, Caleb produced a plain gold band. Martha's ring. The feel of it on my finger was like a brand of cold iron, sealing me to this monster. "You may kiss the bride," the Reverend said, his voice barely a whisper. Caleb turned to me. His eyes were triumphant. He leaned in, his lips cold and firm against mine. It wasn't a kiss. It was an act of possession. It was over. I was Mrs. Thomas Brennan, or rather, Mrs. Caleb Brennan. Legally, I was his. My last chance was gone. Or was it? After the ceremony, Caleb announced we were going to the general store for supplies. As we walked across the street, I could feel the eyes of the town on us. They knew. They had to know. They were just too afraid to act. The store was run by a man named Henderson, a large man whose jovial demeanor seemed forced, brittle. "Well, look at you, Thomas," he boomed a little too loudly. "Finally tied the knot. Congratulations to you both." Caleb just grunted in response, already gathering supplies. Henderson's eyes met mine over a sack of flour, and in them I saw the same fear and pity I'd seen in the Reverend's. This was it, now or never. I moved away from Caleb, pretending to admire a bolt of fabric. As Henderson passed by, I stumbled, dropping my handbag. Its contents spilled across the floorboards. "Oh, clumsy me," I said, my voice high and flustered. As Henderson bent to help me, his back to Caleb, I pressed the folded photograph of the real Thomas Brennan into his hand. My fingers brushed his, and I gave a slight, desperate shake of my head. His eyes widened for a fraction of a second. He understood. He palmed the photograph, scooped up the rest of my things, and handed them back to me with a shaky smile. "No trouble at all, ma'am," he said, his eyes darting nervously toward Caleb. Caleb hadn't noticed. He was arguing with the clerk about the price of ammunition. I had done it. I had planted the seed. Now I just had to pray it would grow. The ride back to the ranch was even more tense than the ride to town. Caleb was in a foul mood, muttering about the prices, about the prying eyes of the townsfolk. He seemed to sense that something had shifted, that his control was no longer absolute. As we neared the ranch, he suddenly pulled the wagon to a halt. He pointed to a small, lonely clearing a little way from the road, where a single, crude wooden cross stood crookedly in the snow. "That's her," he said, his voice flat. "Martha." I stared at the grave. It felt wrong. There were no flowers, no loving epitaph, just a stark, lonely marker. "Fever, you said?" I asked, my voice a whisper. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing. "That's what I said." He snapped the reins and the wagon lurched forward, leaving the sad little grave behind. But I had seen something, something that made my blood run cold. Carved into the rough wood of the cross, almost obscured by weather and time, were two dates. The year of her death was 5 years ago. But Caleb had told me he'd only been at the ranch for 8 years, and his brother Thomas had died 3 winters ago. The dates didn't add up. Martha hadn't been Thomas's wife. She must have been Caleb's. The story he told me, the story of the fever, it was a lie. He hadn't just stolen his brother's ranch and his bride. He had stolen his brother's entire life story. He was a cuckoo, a monster who had pushed the rightful occupants out of the nest and taken it for his own. And as we pulled up to the cabin, my new legally recognized prison, I knew one thing for certain. I was not going to end up in a lonely, forgotten grave like Martha. I would fight. I would survive. And I would uncover the truth of what really happened to the kind, gentle man named Thomas Brennan. That night something changed in him. The pretense was over. He was no longer the silent, brooding stranger. He was the master of the house, and I was his possession. He didn't climb to the loft. After our silent, tense dinner, he pulled up a chair by the fire, a bottle of whiskey in his hand, and watched me. Every move I made, every breath I took. "You'll learn to like it here," he said, his voice slurring slightly from the whiskey. "It's a good life, a strong life. No room for weakness." He took a long pull from the bottle. "My brother, he was weak. Always reading those stupid books, talking about feelings. Feelings don't put food on the table. Feelings don't get you through a blizzard." I said nothing. I just sat there, my hands clenched in my lap, my mind racing. Where was Thomas's body? What had Caleb done with him? The ranch was vast. He could be buried anywhere. He didn't appreciate what he had, Caleb continued, his eyes glassy. This land. A good woman. He looked at me, a possessive, drunken gleam in his eyes. He didn't deserve any of it. He didn't deserve Martha. He said her name with a sneer, a twist of his lips that was pure venom. She was weak, too, always crying, always complaining about the loneliness. I tried to make her strong. I tried to teach her what this land demands. But she wouldn't learn. He drained the bottle and slammed it down on the table. So I had to fix the problem. My blood turned to ice. He wasn't just a thief and a liar. He was a murderer. He had killed his own wife. And what had he done to his brother? He stood up, swaying slightly, and took a step toward me. Now it's just you and me. And you're going to be a much better wife than she was. You're strong. I can see it. You're a survivor. He reached for me, his hand a heavy, clumsy thing. I scrambled back, my chair tipping over with a crash. I ran for the bedroom, my only thought to get the door between us. I slammed it shut and fumbled for the bolt, but he was too fast. The door burst open, and he stood there, his face a mask of rage. There are no locked doors in my house, he roared. You belong to me now. Everything here belongs to me. But as he lunged for me, there was a loud, sharp bang from outside. A gunshot. Caleb froze. His head snapped toward the window. Another shot rang out, closer this time. Someone was out there. Someone was coming for me. Henderson had understood. The photograph had worked. Hope, fierce and bright, surged through me. Caleb's drunken rage turned to cunning fear. He grabbed me, his arm clamping around my throat like a band of iron. He dragged me toward the back of the cabin, away from the front door. They're not taking you, he snarled, his breath hot and sour in my ear. You're mine. He shoved me toward a small, heavy door set into the floor that I hadn't noticed before, a root cellar. Get in, he hissed, pulling it open to reveal a set of steep, dark stairs leading down into the blackness. And if you make a sound, I swear I'll bury you down there with him. With him. My heart stopped. It wasn't a threat. It was a confession. Thomas was down there, buried beneath the house he had built. The root cellar was a tomb. It was cold and damp, and the air was thick with the smell of earth and decay. Caleb shoved me down the stairs, and I landed in a heap on the dirt floor. He slammed the heavy door shut, and the world was plunged into absolute blackness. I heard the scrape of a heavy piece of furniture being dragged over the top of the door. I was trapped, buried alive. Panic clawed at my throat, hot and sharp. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the earth. I was alone in the dark, with the ghost of the man I was supposed to marry. My hands scrambled in the dirt, searching for anything, a rock, a piece of wood, something to fight with. My fingers closed around something hard and smooth. It was a bone, a human bone. I recoiled in horror, scrambling away, my back hitting the cold, damp wall of the cellar. He was here. Thomas was here. Caleb had buried his own brother beneath his feet and was living on top of his grave. A cold, clear rage burned away my fear. I would not die here. I would not become another one of Caleb's secrets, buried in the dark. I began to feel my way around the small space, my hands exploring the rough wooden walls, the dirt floor. My fingers brushed against something else, a small metal box. It was heavy, locked, but the lock was old and rusted. I searched the floor again, my fingers digging in the dirt. I found a loose rock. Using all my strength, I began to hammer at the lock. The sound was deafening in the small space, but I didn't care. Let him hear. Let him know I was still fighting. Outside, I could hear shouting, the voices of Henderson and the town doctor. They were trying to break down the front door. I hammered at the lock with renewed desperation. It finally broke with a sharp crack. I pried the lid open. Inside, nestled on a bed of rotting velvet, were Thomas's things. A small collection of poetry books, a silver locket with a picture of a smiling woman who must have been his mother, and a set of letters tied with a ribbon. They were from Martha. Love letters, filled with hope and dreams for their future together. And tucked at the very bottom was a legal document, the deed to the ranch, signed and dated in Thomas Brennan's name. This was it. This was the proof. This was the weapon that would finally bring Caleb down. Suddenly, the cellar door was ripped open. Light flooded the space, blinding me. Caleb stood there, silhouetted against the lamplight from the cabin. His face was a mask of pure fury. Behind him, I could see the splintered remains of the front door. Henderson and the others had gotten in. "I told you to be quiet," Caleb snarled, starting down the stairs toward me. But I was ready. As he reached the bottom step, I threw the metal box with all my might. It caught him square in the face. He staggered back with a cry of pain and surprise. It was the opening I needed. I scrambled up the stairs past him, out into the cabin. Henderson was there, a rifle in his hands. The doctor was behind him. "He's the one!" I screamed, pointing back at the cellar. "He's Caleb! He killed Thomas! He's buried down there!" Caleb lunged out of the cellar, his face a bloody mess, his eyes wild with cornered animal rage. He ignored Henderson's rifle and came straight for me, but he had forgotten about the storm inside me. As he reached for me, I grabbed a heavy iron skillet from the stove and swung it with all the force of my fear and my fury. It connected with the side of his head with a sickening crack. He crumpled to the floor and lay still. It was over. The aftermath was a blur. The sheriff arrived from a neighboring town, summoned by a rider Henderson had sent before the confrontation. They found Thomas's remains in the root cellar, just as I'd said. The letters, the deed, the journal. It was all the proof they needed. Caleb Brennan, the man who had tried to steal a life, was hauled away in chains, his reign of terror finally at an end. The town of Copper Falls, released from the fear that had held it silent for so long, treated me with a kindness that was overwhelming. Mrs. Morrison took me in, clucking over me like a mother hen. Henderson made sure I had everything I needed. They told me the stories they had been too afraid to tell before. How they had suspected something was wrong after the real Thomas, a man they all liked and respected, had suddenly left, and his surly, violent brother had taken over. They had seen Caleb's cruelty to Martha, but had been powerless to intervene. My arrival had been the catalyst, the spark that finally gave them the courage to act. Legally, the situation was complicated, but with the deed in Thomas's name, and the entire town testifying to Caleb's deception, the law found a way. As the intended bride of Thomas Brennan, the ranch was mine, his final gift to me. I stood on the porch of the cabin a week later, looking out over the land. It was no longer a prison, it was a promise, a legacy. I thought of the man I had never met, the kind, gentle soul who loved poetry and dreamed of building a life here. Caleb had been wrong. It wasn't weakness to love, to feel, to dream. It was the greatest strength of all. I walked out to the lonely grave with the crooked cross. With Henderson's help, I dug up the simple marker. We would give Martha a proper burial in the churchyard, next to the brother-in-law she had admired, and away from the monster who had destroyed her. And in its place, we would put a new stone, one for Thomas Brennan, a good man who deserved to be remembered. I chose to stay. I could have sold the ranch and returned to the city, but that would have felt like a retreat. This land had tested me, forged me into someone stronger than I ever thought I could be. This was my home now. I had earned it. The silence of the Montana wilderness no longer felt threatening. It was peaceful, full of possibility. I had come looking for a husband, for security. Instead, I had found myself. And as I stood there, breathing in the crisp, clean air, I knew that the real love story wasn't about a man and a woman. It was about a woman and the wild, beautiful, unforgiving land that she had claimed as her own. My story spread through the territories like a wildfire, a cautionary tale whispered around campfires and in saloons. The story of the mail-order bride who faced down a monster and won. But for me, it was simpler than that. It was the story of survival. The ranch thrived. With the help of the good people of Copper Falls, I learned the rhythms of the land, the language of the seasons. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building. One day, a woman rode up to the ranch. She was elegant, sharp-eyed, and carried herself with an authority that was unmistakable. She introduced herself as a Pinkerton agent. She had been tracking Caleb for months, hired by the family of another young woman who had answered an ad and disappeared into the wilderness. My testimony had been the final piece of the puzzle that led them to him. She told me Caleb would never see the light of day again. That justice, true justice, had been served not just for me, but for all his victims. Her visit closed the final chapter on the darkness, leaving only the clean, blank pages of the future. Years passed. The ranch grew, my herd expanded, and the small cabin became a warm, welcoming home, filled with books and music and the smell of baking bread. I never remarried. My heart was full, my life was my own, and I needed nothing else. I would often sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire and rose. I would think of Thomas, the man whose life I was living, and I would send a silent thank you into the vast, beautiful emptiness. He had provided everything I needed, just as his ad had promised. He had given me a home, he had given me a purpose, and in the end, he had given me myself. This land, once a symbol of terror, was now my sanctuary, a testament to the fact that even in the harshest wilderness, a single determined soul can not only survive, but flourish. And that's the story of Alela Nena Hayes, a woman who walked into a nightmare and carved out a life of her own. It's a reminder that the deepest strengths are often found in the darkest places. If you enjoyed this story and the journey we took together, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. We've got a whole library of tales just like this one, filled with twists and turns you'll never see coming. And don't forget to ring that notification bell so you're the first to know when a new story drops. Now, I want to hear from you. Head down to the comments and let me know, at what point did you first realize the man at the train station wasn't the real Thomas Brennan? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.